Today you will discover the story of Martin, a young man who inherits a mysterious clock after his grandmother's death. But this is no ordinary clock. A hidden message inside it unleashes a chain of secrets and regrets. What legacy did his grandmother truly leave behind? Nothing is as it. Martin gazes at the clock in his hands, a mix of confusion and melancholy on his face. The wooden box where he found it still lies open on the table, and his grandmother's old house feels larger and quieter now that she's gone. The clock, with its heavy, solid gold structure and engravings that seem to whisper forgotten stories, marks 12 o'clock sharp, but its ticking has stopped. That mechanical silence, so unlike the constant echo that once filled the air when his grandmother carried it with her, feels like a reproach. Her voice echoes in his mind. Time is the greatest gift, Martin. She always said it, like a mantra he never fully understood. As a child, he would scoff at the phrase, associating it with his grandmother's habit of treasuring moments over possessions. Now, years later, with debts piling up and his life in chaos due to poor choices, those words seem like an insistent echo haunting him. He leans back in the rickety chair and runs his finger over the clock's engravings, each line seeming to conceal a secret his grandmother never shared. The afternoon light filters through the faded curtains, caressing the clock as if trying to restore some life to it. Martin looks away, uneasy, as if someone were watching him. The truth is, he doesn't have time for memories. There are bills to pay, and that clock with its solid gold and apparent antiquity could be worth a fortune. He presses his lips together, pockets the clock, and stands up. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he murmurs to the air. Outside, reality awaits with all its harshness. Martin stops in front of the jeweler's display, the heavy clock in his pocket serving as a constant reminder of the decisions pressing down on him. The store, with its gleaming showcases and air of exclusivity, feels out of place amidst the tangle of problems that define his life. He takes a deep breath before entering, determined to at least find out how much the piece might be worth. After all, he has no other choice. The interior is cool and silent, a bubble that contrasts sharply with the street's bustle. An older man with round glasses and an air of professional curiosity greets him from behind the counter. "How can I help you?" he asks, his politeness measured. Martin places the clock on the counter, feeling a pang of something that might be guilt or nervousness. "I want to know how much it's worth," he says, offering no details about its origin. The jeweler carefully picks up the clock, his movements filled with a respect Martin hadn't expected. He examines the engravings with a magnifying glass, inspects the stopped mechanism, and finally weighs it on a small scale. His expression shifts as he works, moving from curiosity to restrained astonishment. "This is not just a gold clock," he finally says almost reverently. "It's a unique piece, likely from the early 19th century. Are you sure you want to sell it?" Martin swallows hard. "I just need to know how much it's worth," he insists. The man observes him for a moment before naming a figure that leaves Martin breathless. It's far more than he had imagined, enough to cover his debts and start over. However, the jeweler's words linger in his mind. It's a unique piece. For a moment, Martin hesitates, thinking of his grandmother and how she always valued what couldn't be bought with money. But the weight of his problems pulls him back to reality. In a firm voice, he says, "I'll sell it." The jeweler nods, a mix of approval and resignation on his face as he begins preparing the paperwork. Martin signs quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind. When the clock disappears into the back room, he feels an odd emptiness, as if he had given away more than just an object. But he convinces himself it's just his imagination. Outside, life goes on, and with the money in his hands, he believes he can at least face it. Or so he thinks. Martin wakes in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. The room is steeped in shadows, but the echo of a dream lingers in his mind, so vivid he can almost feel his grandmother's presence. He had seen her sitting in her favorite armchair, the one that still occupies a dusty corner in the old house. She seemed calm, but something in her gaze, a mix of tenderness and disappointment, pierced him like a dagger. He gets up and paces around his small apartment, the creaking floorboards accompanying the weight of his unease. The bills he received for the clock are stacked on the table. For a moment, he tries to convince himself he did the right thing. "I had no other choice," he whispers, as if repetition could turn it into the truth. But it's not enough. Martin makes a cup of coffee while the image of his grandmother lingers in his thoughts. He recalls the afternoons when she would sit him beside her, showing him the clock and teaching him to listen to its ticking as a lesson in patience. "Time isn't something we can accumulate, Martin. We can only decide how to use it," she would say, stroking his head with the hand that now only lives in his memory. The coffee grows cold in the cup, forgotten as he sits by the window, staring at the sleeping city. He feels an emptiness that even the money cannot fill. It's deeper than the debts that burden him, darker than the problems he faces. It's as if he has lost something essential, something he cannot recover. But Martin tries to justify himself. "It was necessary," he murmurs. His hands toy with a pen, tracing unconscious circles on a crumpled piece of paper. He clings to the idea that the money will bring him stability, allowing him to fix the accumulated mistakes in his life. Yet, a whisper in his mind, like his grandmother's voice, reminds him that not everything lost can be replaced. Finally, exhausted, he returns to bed, knowing sleep will be elusive. Guilt accompanies him like a shadow, whispering truths he doesn't want to face. "I had no other choice," he repeats, but each time it sounds more hollow. In the darkness, Martin wonders if anything could fill the void left by the clock and what it represented. Martin was at his small desk, reviewing bills and sums that didn't add up, when the phone rang. The screen displayed an unknown number. With a heavy sigh, he answered, expecting yet another collection call. "Martin Lopez?" asked a voice on the other end. "Yes, this is he. Who's calling?" he responded, uninterested. "This is Mr. Mendez, the jeweler to whom you sold your clock a few days ago." Martin straightened in his chair, a knot forming in his stomach. He hadn't expected to hear from that place again, much less receive a call. Before he could say anything, the jeweler continued, "I hope I'm not bothering you, but I found something I think you should see. When we opened the clock for a thorough examination, we discovered a hidden compartment inside. There was a message, a small note that I thought might interest you." Martin's heart began to race. He couldn't imagine what his grandmother might have left inside the clock. His voice came out more nervous than he expected. "A message? What kind?" "I can't say more over the phone. It's something personal without a doubt. You should come see it yourself." Martin hesitated for a moment. He had tried to bury everything related to the clock since selling it, but something in the jeweler's tone unsettled him. Moreover, the idea of a hidden message from his grandmother sparked a curiosity he couldn't ignore. "All right," he said, feeling the weight of his decision. "I'll stop by this afternoon." The rest of the day felt endless. The numbers on the bills in front of him blurred as his mind kept returning to the jeweler's words. What could his grandmother have written that was important enough to hide inside the clock? The question both unsettled and excited him. When he finally arrived at the jewelry shop, Mr. Mendez greeted him with a cordial smile but an unusual air of seriousness. Without many words, he led Martin to a small room at the back of the store. On the work table lay the clock, now disassembled, and a yellowed piece of paper carefully placed beside it. "Here it is," said the jeweler, pointing to the paper. Martin approached slowly, his hands trembling as he picked up the note. The handwriting, though somewhat worn by time, was unmistakable. It was his grandmother's. His eyes scanned the words, and the air around him seemed to pause. "My dear Martin, if this clock is no longer with you, I hope it has helped you in a time of need. Always remember that material things do not define who you are. The true treasure lies in how you use your time and with whom you choose to share it. With all my love, Grandma." The words hit Martin like a wave, leaving his mind blank and his heart filled with a mix of emotions. The full weight of the clock, its sale, and his grandmother's words crashed over him all at once. For the first time in days, he was at a loss for words. Martin rereads the message over and over, as if his grandmother's words might change with each reading. But there they remain, clear and precise, resonating in his mind as though she were standing before him, speaking in her warm voice. "Don't cling to material things," he reads again, and a pang hits his chest. The relief he should feel from her understanding words mixes with a knot of regret. "This isn't all," the jeweler interrupts, pulling him from his thoughts. Martin looks up, confused. "What do you mean?" The jeweler shows him a small object placed next to the clock, a tiny key, so small it almost looks like an ornament. The dark metal is worn with age, and its base bears a design Martin instantly recognizes. It's the same pattern that decorates the back of the clock. "We found it in the same compartment as the message," Mr. Mendez explains. "It seems to have been part of the clock from the beginning, but I have no idea what it might open. Do you?" Martin carefully takes the key, examining it closely. It's so small it feels light in his palm, but its symbolic weight is immense. His mind immediately races through childhood memories, searching for any clue that might connect this object to his grandmother. But nothing comes to mind. No locked furniture, no chest, no special door. Nothing. "I don't know," he finally replies, his voice barely a whisper. The jeweler observes him with a gaze that combines curiosity and respect before nodding slowly. "It might be worth investigating," he suggests, handing him the disassembled clock as well. "You can take it if you like. It no longer has its mechanism, but if you'd like to keep it as a memento..." Martin shakes his head. He's already sold the clock, and although the message and the key have reignited something within him, he doesn't feel he has the right to take it back now. Still, he carefully places the key in his pocket, bidding farewell to the jeweler with a handshake. Back at home, the key feels as though it's burning in his pocket. He sits at the table, placing it in front of him as if he might unravel its secret simply by staring at it. A part of him is tempted to let it go, to convince himself that what he's read and received is enough. But something deeper, a latent restlessness he can't ignore, drives him forward. That night, in his small apartment, Martin begins to comb through his memories of his grandmother, searching for a clue. The message in the clock said, "Don't cling to material things." But something about the key suggests there's more. And now, for the first time in a long while, Martin feels a different spark. Not guilt or regret, but the need to uncover what his grandmother wanted him to know. Martin walks through his grandmother's old house with the tiny key in his pocket, the creaking floor echoing with every step. Everything about the place feels both familiar and strange, as though the years of neglect had turned this childhood, refuge, into an alien space. Yet something within him urges him forward. The key must unlock something here, and he's determined to find it. He starts in the living room, going through the old furniture that still smells of wood and his grandmother's life. He opens drawers, examines cabinets, but nothing seems to match the tiny key. His frustration grows as hours pass, but then he remembers the attic. For years, his grandmother had forbidden him from going up there, saying it was dusty and dangerous, but now he feels it might hold the answer. He climbs the steep stairs leading to the attic, each step creaking under his weight, Light filters through a small window, illuminating a chaotic mess of stacked boxes, furniture covered in sheets, and forgotten items. Martin takes a deep breath and begins searching, lifting lids and dusting off buried memories. Finally, in a dark corner, he finds a small chest covered in dust and cobwebs. It's old, its edges worn, and the same design engraved on the lock matches the key. His heart pounds as he inserts the key and turns it. The metallic click echoes in the attic, breaking the silence. Martin opens the chest slowly, as if afraid of what he might find inside. Within lies a collection of objects that speak of a life he never knew. There are yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon, black and white photographs showing his grandmother in her youth, surrounded by friends in unknown places, and small personal items like a locket with a miniature portrait. As he examines the contents, Martin finds one letter in particular addressed to him. His name was written in the same handwriting he recognized from the clock's message. He opened the letter with trembling hands and began to read. "My dear Martin, if you are reading this, it means you found something more than just a clock. I want you to know that life is built on sacrifices, and every decision we make, even the hardest ones, serves a purpose. In my youth, I had to choose between my dreams and the people I loved, and while my path was difficult, I never regretted giving everything for others. This chest holds a part of my story that I never shared, because I wanted you to discover it when you were ready. I hope that within these letters and objects, you'll find the inspiration to move forward, to understand that time and the love we share are the only things that truly matter." The words left Martin breathless. He spent hours poring over the letters, which revealed that his grandmother had secretly worked to help families in difficult times, sacrificing her own dreams so others could thrive. The photographs depicted a brave woman surrounded by grateful faces, but also hinted at the loneliness she must have felt at times. Martin closed the chest at dawn, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions he couldn't name. He felt a newfound respect for the woman his grandmother had been, but also a deep urge to reevaluate his own life. For the first time in a long while, he wondered if he could set aside the weight of his mistakes and sacrifice for something greater than himself. The words in the letters seemed to glow in Martin's mind as he reread them under the dim lamplight. Over and over, his grandmother mentioned a special place, a forest where she said time stood still. Each mention carried an unusual blend of nostalgia and serenity, as if the place had been her sanctuary when life became overwhelming. Driven by growing curiosity and a desire to understand his grandmother better, Martin resolved to find it. The next morning, armed with the detailed descriptions in the letters and an old hand-drawn map he had found in the chest, Martin set out on the journey. The forest was a few hours away, on the outskirts of the city, far from the noise and haste that had consumed his life. As he drove, flashes of childhood memories overwhelmed him. Days when his grandmother taught him to watch the clouds, listen to the wind, and most of all, cherish simple moments. When he finally arrived, the air seemed different. The forest was dense but welcoming, filled with tall trees whose moss-covered trunks bore witness to time. A faint path meandered through them, marked more by the passage of years than by human footsteps. Martin walked slowly, feeling the calm of the place envelop him with each step. The silence, broken only by birdsong and the crunch of leaves underfoot, was almost deafening compared to the chaos of his usual life. Following the directions in the letters, Martin found a small clearing in the forest, a space where a worn wooden bench rested against an ancient oak. The view was simple, yet breathtaking. A carpet of grass bathed in light filtering through the canopy of trees. On the bench was a rusty plaque, engraved with words that stopped Martin in his tracks. For Maria, who understood that time is not measured in clocks, but in moments lived. Martin stood motionless before the bench, his gaze fixed on the plaque. The engraved words seemed to burn in his mind. His grandmother had repeated this phrase so often it felt like a family saying, But here, in this remote and tranquil place, it carried a weight he had never felt before. He sat down slowly on the bench, his hands resting on the rough wood. A wave of memories crashed over him. Days when his grandmother took him to the park, listening to him with endless patience, even to the silliness of his childhood. Afternoons when they shared quiet moments, simply watching the sun fade behind the trees. He had so many memories like those with her. But as he grew older, they were lost in the rush of life and the misplaced priorities that had led him to where he was now. Martin took a deep breath, trying to contain the swelling tide of emotions. "How much time have I wasted?" he murmured, as though the forest could answer. He had spent years obsessed with paying bills, getting more, and solving problems, only to realize now that the essentials had faded into the background. The calls he didn't return, the visits he postponed, the times he thought there would always be more time for everything. But now, there was no time left for her. The wind rose softly, as if the forest wanted to offer comfort, but Martin only felt the weight of his guilt. His grandmother had lived with a clarity he never had. She understood what truly mattered, and he, despite having been so close to her, had failed to learn that lesson when he needed it most. The small wooden box he had found among the tree roots sat beside him, still unopened. But Martin didn't feel ready to open it. There was something deeper he needed to confront before discovering its contents. He looked at his hands, hardened from years of temporary jobs, and realized he had always worked to fill a void that now seemed endless. Everything he had gained, everything he had lost. Did it really mean anything? As the sun begins to set, painting the clearing with golden hues, Martin feels as though the forest is challenging him. He cannot move forward without confronting the truth. He had disconnected his life from the people who truly mattered, blinded by a purpose that was never his own. For the first time in years, he lets the mask he has used to justify himself fall away. Sitting on that bench, surrounded by the calm his grandmother had loved so much, Martin faces a painful revelation. He hadn't just lost time, he had lost a part of himself. With silent tears streaming down his cheeks, Martin picks up the wooden box. Something tells him that his grandmother, even after all this, didn't leave him without guidance. Perhaps, just perhaps, there is still a chance for redemption. But at that moment, all he feels is the weight of the things he can never recover. The forest breeze brushes Martin's face as he holds the small wooden box in his hands. For an instant he feels caught between the guilt of his past and a flickering hope for the future. Slowly he opens the box. Inside is a small pocket watch, simple and humble, accompanied by a note written in his grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. "Time is a gift you choose how to use. Don't fear losing it. Fear not living it." Martin reads the words again and again. The lesson, so simple and powerful, seems to dispel the shadows that have weighed on him since he sold the clock. He realizes that not all is lost, that he can still change. There is still time to amend his mistakes and live as his grandmother had taught him, prioritizing moments, not things. When he returns to the city, the first thing Martin does is go to the jewelry store. He knows it won't be easy to recover the clock, but he has to try. The jeweler, surprised by his determination, informs him that the piece has been sold to a collector. Though disheartened, Martin doesn't give up. He investigates, makes calls, and eventually manages to locate the buyer, an older man passionate about antique clocks. The meeting with the collector is tense. Martin, speaking sincerely, tells the story of the clock and what it means to him. He talks about his grandmother, the lessons she left him, and how the piece is a tangible link to the moments he treasures most. The man, moved by Martin's honesty, agrees to return the clock, asking for only a fraction of the price he paid. With the clock finally back in his hands, Martin feels a relief that goes beyond the object itself. It's as if in recovering it, He has found a part of himself that had been lost. But he knows that having it back isn't enough. His grandmother's true legacy lies not in the clock, but in what he does with the time he has. From that day forward, Martin begins to mend the damaged relationships in his life. He calls his mother, whom he had barely spoken to in years, and spends an entire afternoon with her, listening to childhood stories he had never heard. He visits an old friend he had neglected in his quest for stability, and together they reminisce about days when life seemed simpler. Martin also discovers new ways to share quality time with the people around him. He learns to cook with his mother, something he had always put off. He starts spending time with the neighborhood children, teaching them small tricks his grandmother had shown him, like making toys from simple materials. Each moment, no matter how small, fills him with a satisfaction he had forgotten. The clock now hangs on the wall of his living room, marking time but also serving as a reminder of what truly matters. Each time he looks at it, he thinks of his grandmother, the forest, and the words he found. Time is not measured in clocks, but in moments lived. For the first time, Martin feels that he is living according to that legacy. He cannot undo the past, but he can build a present that honors those who loved him and the lessons they left behind. Martin enters his apartment with the clock carefully wrapped in a linen cloth. He has gone through so much to retrieve it that it now feels almost sacred, not for its material value, but for what it represents. He places it gently on the table and unwraps it. The afternoon light falls across its surface, highlighting the marks of time on its worn metal. The gold is gone. The collector, in an act of generosity, returned the clock after dismantling it for other parts. But Martin doesn't see this as a loss. In some way, it feels more authentic now, more real. The inscription inside the clock remains intact, and each word resonates in his heart. My dear grandson, if this clock is no longer with you, it must have relieved an important burden. Don't cling to material things. The time we shared is what matters most. He has read it so many times he could recite it by heart. But every time he sees it, the words seem to have something new to teach him. With a hammer and nail in hand, Martin searches for the perfect spot for the clock. He finally decides to hang it on the wall of the living room, just above the small table where he now spends his afternoons writing and reflecting. As he secures the clock in place, he feels a mix of solemnity and satisfaction, as though he's closing an important chapter of his life and starting a new one. From that day on, the clock becomes a constant presence in Martin's home. It doesn't tell the time. Its mechanism remains broken, but Martin doesn't need it to. Every time he looks at it, he is reminded of what truly matters: people, moments, and connections that transcend time. It serves as a reminder that his grandmother is still present in every decision he makes, in every minute he chooses to live fully. The space in his home begins to transform alongside him. The once empty, cold walls now display photographs of happy moments with family and friends. The living room table, once covered in papers and bills, now holds a notebook where Martin writes small reflections, lessons he's learned, and goals he hopes to achieve. Everything he does, even the smallest details, seems to revolve around his grandmother's legacy. One night, while having dinner with his mother at home, she looks at the clock and smiles. I always used to tell your grandmother that the clock wasn't worth as much as she thought, but now I see it was never about the gold, she says with a soft laugh. Martin smiles too, raising his glass for a toast. She always knew what really mattered, and now I think I do too. The clink of their glasses echoes in the quiet apartment, and Martin feels a peace he hasn't known in years. The clock is no longer just an object. It is an anchor, a beacon reminding him that time is a gift and that every moment can be lived fully. In his home, the clock doesn't measure hours, but it marks a new beginning. Each morning, when Martin wakes, the clock is the first thing he sees from his bed. Hanging on the living room wall, its presence fills the apartment with a serene energy, as though his grandmother's essence had imbued it. Though it no longer functions, its meaning transcends the tangible. It is not just a clock, but a reminder of the most important lessons of his life. Martin has changed. His life, once defined by rushing and superficial worries, is now focused on what truly matters: human connections, shared moments of joy, and the value of a life well lived. He has learned to pause, to appreciate the small gestures, and to prioritize what is essential over what is urgent. The clock becomes the centerpiece of his home, not just as decoration, but as a symbol of redemption. Visitors soon notice it, and Martin always takes a moment to share the story behind it, not with sadness, but with gratitude. He talks about his grandmother, the lessons she left him, and how that seemingly simple object transformed his perspective on life. Every time he shares the story, he feels his grandmother's words live on through him. One afternoon, while cleaning the house, Martin pauses in front of the clock. He reflects on how, for so long, he was lost, trapped in a cycle of meaningless worries. Now he understands that his grandmother always wanted him to see beyond the material, to learn to value the invisible: time, relationships, and the impact we leave on others. His grandmother's true gift wasn't the clock, it was her example. The way she lived her life, with humility, courage, and a deep appreciation for the small but meaningful moments. Martin smiles and gently touches the edge of the clock, as if to thank it for its presence. From that moment, he makes a decision: to use his grandmother's lessons to create real change in his life and the lives of those around him. He begins volunteering at a community center, helping young people who face challenges similar to those he once experienced. His afternoons, once lonely and filled with regret, are now full of purpose. Though the clock is motionless, it continues to mark something essential: a new rhythm in Martin's life. Each time he looks at it, he is reminded that time is not something to fear, but something to embrace. In his small apartment, the clock doesn't just signify a new beginning. It symbolizes a life filled with meaning, love, and redemption. And so, Martin's life transforms. His grandmother is no longer physically present, but her legacy lives on in every decision he makes, in every moment he chooses to live fully. The clock remains there, silent but eternal, a witness to Martin's journey toward understanding, reconciliation, and finally, peace.